We talked grades on the Tuesday episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast, but let's talk more about what some of these younger players are contributing right now. And we're going to focus on the 1-2 punch again at the running back position with Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. Is it changing how the Steelers are going to use their running backs? Also, have the offensive line's improvement been enough to not overhaul the investment in the offseason? And finally, with Deshaun Watson 3 touchdowns this past weekend, how worried should the Steelers be in changing their game plan of how to attack the Browns? All that and more right here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm joined today by Cale Berger of 93.7 The Fan. I'm Chris Carter, your host. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you a daily dose of all things of the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button in the video if you enjoy it. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM game. Ultimate Football GM is a game you can play right on your phone, and you can command your own franchise as the GM, make all the decisions that you would make in running your team. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or just look it up in any app store on your phones. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise with using the promo code LOCKEDON. That's LOCKEDON, Locked On, all capital letters, all one word, when you get to the game store. As I said before, we're joined by Cale Berger, the man himself from 93.7 The Fan. I was on just with him on the final word, breaking things down after the Steelers win over the Ravens. Cale, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thanks for having me. Excited to make my maiden voyage on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to have you. Sorry we haven't had you here before. But, Cale, one thing that I talked with Alan Saunders when we were going over grades for the Ravens game is that Jaylen Warren's ability to contribute to the Steelers' offense really balanced the running game. We've seen for years, and you've seen it, when Le'Veon Bell was with the Steelers, they would run him so much sometimes that LeGarrette Blount literally quit on in mid game because he was just so upset with how much they used Le'Veon Bell. But in doing it this way, the Steelers still gained 187 yards with their running backs just on the ground. But 22 carries for Najee Harris, 111 yards, 12 carries for Jaylen Warren. It's something that Alan Saunders talked about and then I talked about was Jaylen Warren not only is maybe helping keep Najee fresh during games, but this might be the way to make Najee Harris last longer as a Steelers running back.
Yeah, and that's always kind of the big debate and question, especially drafting a running back in the first round in the modern era. It's about the return on investment, right? Mm-hmm. Using that kind of a resource on a position that is so fickle in a way that you don't know how long those guys are going to last. And, I think that's certainly something we saw with Le'Veon Bell, that the Steelers continued to go with that bell cow mentality that so many other teams in the NFL have kind of put by the wayside and moved on from a traditional football sense. They stuck with that with Le'Veon Bell. And we saw as, seasons ended and they got to the portions of the seasons where the games matter the most, Le'Veon Bell was either, worn down from overuse or overall injured and unavailable because of kind of the tread that wasn't really left on those tires. So that was something for me, especially this offseason, looking at Najee Harris thinking, okay, he is the Steelers' star running back. He is their bell cow entering his second year. One of the big things I thought the Steelers had to do all offseason was find a number two, find a B, find a running mate for Najee Harris. Not really a guy to take half his carries or something and have it be a true running back by committee, but just in a sense to make him last longer, keep him fresher, and take some of that wear and tear off of him. I was thinking maybe it'd be a free agent signing or something like that, but you got to look under every rock and behind every corner, and they find a guy, an undrafted free agent in Jaylen Warren, and I think he's been a perfect addition. He's been a great change of pace, and he's accomplished exactly that because Najee Harris right now is playing the best football of his career, coming off what we both agree was the best game of his career against the Ravens on Sunday. And he's doing it at the most important time of the season, which is week 17, week 18, when you're vying for a playoff spot.
Absolutely. And I also think it's important because the Steelers knew, even if, say, they got, I don't know, Eric Bieniemy as their offensive coordinator, even if everything worked out for things and Kenny Pickett was turning into Patrick Mahomes before our eyes, even let's say all that stuff happens, right? You're still looking at a situation where that's most likely not going to happen. You're still looking at a situation where you want to run the ball to protect your young quarterback so that you're not forcing him to be a superstar quarterback, because they knew Kenny Pickett, even though the most NFL pro-ready quarterback, and I think after seeing Desmond Ridder and Malik Willis play a little bit, people will now understand, there's a little bit more that goes into that, right? But I think it's so important to have a guy like this. When the Steelers offered Le'Veon Bell the big contract that they did back in 2018 that he didn't accept, I thought I saw that as they want to keep the running back around that's been carrying the offense so that whenever Ben Roethlisberger does retire, he could kind of be the guy that hands off the offense to the next quarterback that they draft. And then, of course, Le'Veon Bell left, and that never became a thing. And then Ben played a little bit longer than some people might have expected. But you saw how Kenny Pickett has come in. They drafted Najee Harris. He kind of had to learn that quickly from Ben Roethlisberger, and Ben Roethlisberger talked about how he's trying to pass on his knowledge of how the offense works and how to win games and things like that to Najee, because he saw I got to pass something along to somebody. And now here you have Najee as a second-year player. He's not necessarily passing things on to Kenny, but they're learning together, and he's able to take that load off of the rookie quarterback to have to make all the plays for the Steelers to move the ball.
One of the things we've said since the beginning of time about rookie quarterbacks, young quarterbacks, what's one of the best things you can do to help them? That's give them a viable, productive run game. And through the first couple of weeks of the season, the first couple months of the season, the Steelers certainly didn't have that. But ever since that bye week, they have completely turned a corner in that department. I think part of it is kudos to the offensive line for them gelling and coming together, but it's also partially a credit to Najee Harris and, him getting back to – he looked to me on Sunday like the running back that we saw at Alabama that warranted taking a first-round pick, shedding tacklers, the perfect combination of physicality and elusiveness, which is what makes you a great running back, and especially he was so great about his skill set at his size, but also the agility that he has too. And I think you made a really good point on Sunday about the Steelers are – kind of on the fly last couple of years have, retooled their locker room just in terms of they're getting new leaders. They're overhauling the leadership and getting a new kind of generation of Steelers leaders in that locker room. So just like you're saying about how Najee Harris is helping bring along Kenny Pickett, I think part of the attractive thing with Najee Harris is that he's becoming that leader and that vocal guy along with Kenny Pickett. Those two rising up through the ranks together as leaders in the Steelers locker room is, I think, another thing we can't undersell how vital is that to the future of this team.
Absolutely. And one last thing before we move on to the offensive line here that I want to talk about, but I think it's also important to note that Jaylen Warren's contribution is not just to supplement Najee Harris, but as just another running back. You think back to some of the Steelers teams that won Super Bowls, when Willie Parker came in to kind of work with Jerome Bettis, it was the two of them working together that helped make that Super Bowl 40 run. And then 2008, people often forget Muelde Moore was such an important part to that backfield to supplement Willie Parker. And there were times Willie Parker went down and the Steelers knew they had a guy, Muelde Moore, not a guy you'd call on every week to get you 100 yards, but he would occasionally get a game for that for you. And Jaylen Warren shows the potential to get there. I talked to Eddie Faulkner, the running backs coach for the Steelers, during training camp. He told me straight up, he was like, listen, he was our 6th ranked running back of this draft class. We couldn't draft another one because we had other concerns. But when he was sitting there in the free agent pool at the end of the draft, we were like, we're calling him first. And they made sure to get him, and they couldn't be they can't be happier with how this has worked out because he's looking like a good guy, good player.
He's been so productive, and especially in little spurts, not getting a lot of opportunities. But a credit to a young player like that is when you are getting few opportunities to make sure that you are capitalizing on them and making the most of them. And that's exactly what I applaud Jaylen Warren for, because even they worked in some wrinkles this past week, which I really was excited about offensively, where they had both running backs on the field at the same time. Najee is in the backfield, standing, 7 yards behind Kenny. And then they had some other wrinkles where, Warren's kind of a wing back and he comes across and gets those jet sweeps. I mean, they're working him into the offense in more creative ways. But you look at the touches he gets, the opportunities, he is a guy that plays like he was an undrafted free agent and is so thankful and excited about the opportunity he has that he doesn't want to let any rep go by. He doesn't want to let any opportunity go by the wayside. And that's something that you have to tip your cap to him. It's a credit to him, but it's certainly been a huge improvement in addition to the Steelers offense, because whether it's, the 5-yard pops he gets up the middle, whether it's breaking off some of those jet sweeps, or whether it's, him even being a factor in the passing game as well, he has been just really a jolt of energy, juice for this offense that they've needed as just another wrinkle, another weapon. And he's done exactly that.
Absolutely. But the guys that in front of both of these players are huge in making that happen as well. We'll talk about the offensive line because they've played better. I don't think there's no denying that. But of course, that was the biggest concern all year long, was go get offensive linemen. Have their playing better kind of changed those priorities? We'll talk about that in just in a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, we got to talk to you guys about our sponsors at the Ultimate Football GM game. If you've ever dreamed about being an NFL GM, this is your chance, because you can run your own franchise for 25 seasons and make all the decisions for your team. You can pick the team name, the team color, what your city's from, then hire the right coaches, the coordinators, even the team psychiatrist. This game is ridiculously intense with the details that it goes through. Then you'll go through each season, make your draft picks, trade whatever you want, develop players, to hire the guys that develop players, build scouting. It's ridiculous. I did this for 25 seasons and I won 19 championships. Can you do better? Download the Ultimate Football GM game right now, and you can do that. When you do, Locked On listeners do get 100% free boost to all the stats and things that you can buy all the items for in the game by just using the Locked On code in the game store. That's LOCKEDO, and all capital letters, all one word, in the Ultimate Football GM store today. And to download the game, just go to ultimate-gm.com or just look it up in the app stores on your phone. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, Chris Carter with Cale Berger of 93.7 The Fan. Cale, let's get into the offensive line talk, because they had a really good week this week. They bullied people. I talked about it with Alan Saunders. I gave my highest grade of the offensive line this week to Kevin Dotson. We've talked about how James Daniels has really stepped up this year. Chukwuma Okorafor has kind of been the person he has been for most of the year. Not a good pass protector, not a great run blocker, but solid out there at the right tackle position. Dan Moore's taking steps forward. Mason Cole's become a very good asset at the center position. It's been a steady growth, and I think there's kudos that deserves to Pat Meyer. But all season long, Cale, especially when the Steelers were sitting there building a 2-6 record to start the season, everyone's saying, well, got to go get offensive linemen, Now some people are starting to think, well, wait a second, they're getting better. Do they need to invest in the offensive line? Do you see this as still the top priority the Steelers need, or is it somewhere else that it's kind of taken over for what you think they need to target in the NFL draft coming up?
Yeah, I give this offensive line, this unit, a ton of credit, and Pat Meyer a ton of credit too for the progress that they've made, because going into the season, even in training camp or in the preseason, we were all looking at this offensive line saying, all right, it's going to be a long year for Trubisky, Pickett, whoever's at quarterback, and certainly for Najee and the running backs as well, because that offensive line did not look like a unit that was going to really ever find their cohesion, find their chemistry. Well, we've all been pleasantly surprised, because it's been exactly that. And you look at the last couple of weeks, and I look back at that Raiders game too. I don't think Kenny Pickett was sacked once on Christmas Eve. And that's going up against a team that has Max Crosby. Chandler Jones was in that game for a point before he got hurt as well. But those are good pass rushers on that Raiders team. And even though a lot of people, I think, still felt like the offensive line had just a so-so game, well, Kenny Pickett wasn't sacked once. And then we saw what they were able to do in the run game this week. Like you said, just bullying and imposing their will on a Ravens defensive line that sure didn't have Calais Campbell, but still has a lot of very talented players and has a good defensive scheme as well. So with all that being said, they've been impressive. They've had a lot of growth this year. I applaud them for that. I still think you got to make a commitment in this draft to the offensive line. Agree. We've talked about this. Like you said, one of the biggest things, and football can change so much, and we can run 4 wide receiver sets. We can spread everyone out. We can do all this. Football's still won in the trenches, just like it was in 1965. It still is in 2023. It's about big men that can move other big men. And the Steelers right now, that is something that they've somewhat neglected, I think, for the last 10 years or so. The last time they drafted an offensive lineman in the first 2 rounds was David DeCastro.
Yeah.
And right before that, it was Marquise Pouncey. I mean, they haven't invested top quality picks in that unit. And as much as you can applaud them and say, look, they found starters later in drafts and they found some diamonds in the roughs. Well, sometimes you just need some blue chip guys. And I think that's what the Steelers need to prioritize going into this draft is, sure, this unit has made a lot of progress and found some chemistry and done some good things, but you still need some premier prospects, some top tier talent to get them back into the fold and really rejuvenate this Steelers offensive line to be one that can be one of the best units in the NFL for years to come, like they were in those, 2014, 15, 16 Steelers offenses that were lighting up the NFL. We always talk about Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, Ben Roethlisberger. They had a great offensive line, and that's where the football still starts and ends. You have to be able to win in the trenches and up front. We both agree that offensive and defensive line have to be premium positions they look at in the draft coming up still, but you got to applaud what they've done.
No, yeah, absolutely. I applaud what they do. And something I've been saying for like the past about month and a half or so, Pat Meyer deserves a lot of credit too for bringing this group together. Because early in the season, and this was when I was like, y'all, people do too much when people were like, oh, Pat Meyer, he thinks he's an offensive line coach because he hasn't fixed the offensive line in 3 games. I'm just like, that's where it's like, okay, guys, let's slow down. Coaching takes time, especially flipping around a position group where you don't have a lot of studs in there. And not to say that these guys can't become studs. These guys aren't talented people. But, what took rebuilding the Steelers offensive line that made the 2014, 2015, and all up until about 2019 when that group started to age out, what took building that line was first-round pick Marquise Pouncey, first-round pick David DeCastro, second-round pick Marcus Gilbert. And then from those, they were able to fill in, like you said, Ramon Foster, undrafted, Alejandro Villanueva, undrafted, Kelvin Beachum, 7th round. You're able to build it, but you need your catalysts, your guys that get things started. And I will say this, they absolutely did neglect the position for a while, but they also thought, were probably thinking, well, Marquise Pouncey, David DeCastro, they'll probably carry us into the 2020s because, when Pouncey retired, he was 31. Most offensive linemen that are all pro like that, they last until their mid-30s. David DeCastro, he retired at 30. And so you lost 2 superstar all-pro guys in the same offseason, and then we're just like, whoa. Like that, but at the same time, you also had to address, the wide receiver position because Antonio Brown had gone. You had to fix so many other problems, and it became a situation where there's a lot of problems, and they've kind of mitigated it. They finished 9-7-1 last year. Was it 9? Yeah, 9-7-1 last year. As they did, they have a chance to finish 9-8 this year. They've stayed afloat, but you're right. They need to invest in this group because just how we talked about how the running backs are a way to help Kenny Pickett, the offensive line is even better way to help Kenny Pickett because it'll not only be the group that paves the way for the ground game, but it'll kick that much more butt in giving him time to process what's going on in the pocket.
Yeah, and you certainly look at Pouncey and DeCastro. Their timeline was sped up. They thought that they would have more time with those guys, like you said, but I think also you could kind of see the writing was on the wall with them that maybe those guys in the last year or two before they ended up retiring were, declining as any offensive lineman past the age of 30 or so would. You could see that the writing was on the wall that those guys were on the tail end of their careers. They maybe just decided to call it a career a couple of years earlier than we expect from guys nowadays. But yeah, when we look at this upcoming NFL draft, it is, I think, the marquee biggest thing. And especially everything you do, especially from an offensive perspective, has to be centered around what does this do for Kenny Pickett moving forward. He has shown us so much. He's shown so much growth and improvement. They are going to push ahead now with the knowledge or idea and plan that Kenny Pickett is our franchise guy. So if anything and everything has got to be centered on how can we make that transition, make that growth as seamless as possible, continue to set him up for success. They've got him weapons. He's got receivers. He's got running backs. He's got tight ends. The next best thing is let's keep his jersey clean. And that's going to allow Kenny Pickett to continue to develop with his progress. And like the running game you said, too, I mean, this is a symbiotic relationship, those running backs and those offensive line. Improving that unit, continuing to grow that unit is only going to continue to make everything else better on the Steelers team. And, set yourself up for success. Not only do you have the quarterback and receivers and tight ends and running backs and a defense, but you have an offensive line to anchor all of it for the next 7-8 years or so is the ideal scenario for the Steelers. But I got to give Pat Meyer some credit too, like you did. A lot of people were saying, hey, like 3 games, why hasn't it worked yet? Well, what do they say? Rome wasn't built in a day. That's the old phrase, the old saying. he was a brand new coach coming in here into this situation. You had to give him time to at least get to know the guys, let alone just figure out, who works where and what worked best and what to improve upon. He just had to get to know these individuals. And now we're seeing the fruits of that labor showing itself here in this playoff run.
Absolutely. We'll get into the offensive line prospects in this offseason. There's a lot of time to talk about NFL draft stuff. Trust me, it comes every year. Everyone's like, Chris, who's they taking the draft?
We got to do it right now, Chris. We got to do it right now.
We got 3 months of this that's going to be coming. But, just names to look out for. Peter Skoronski is the Northwestern offensive tackle that a lot of people talk about. Paris Johnson Jr. of Ohio State is a huge offensive tackle. He's kind of like the prototype a lot of our people are looking at. There's other guys like Osiris Torrance, a guard for Florida. Broderick Jones, a tackle for Georgia. I like Andrew Voorhees of USC. There's a lot of guys out there that we could talk about, and we'll get to talk about them more in depth in the offseason comes. But I do agree with you, Cale. Just because the Steelers' offensive line has started to find success doesn't mean they still shouldn't invest to get some star players into this group, both in the draft and in free agency. But we got to switch topics a little bit because the Steelers are playing the Browns. And a couple weeks ago, that might have seemed like an easier prospect than playing the Ravens. But the way the Browns played this past weekend might draw some caution. We'll talk about that in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. So don't go anywhere. But first, we got to talk to you guys about our sponsors at LinkedIn. LinkedIn, of course, is the number one place that people go to find jobs. So if you're an employer, that's the number one place that you should be going to find someone to fill your jobs. This is where LinkedIn Jobs comes in to help you. You can create a free job post in just minutes to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people. Then just add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you would like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Did you know that every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm Chris Carter. He's Cale Berger of 93.7 The Fan. Cale, let's get to talking about this upcoming matchup the Steelers have. They're facing the 7-9 Browns. These Browns with Jacoby Brissett beat them early in the season, but I think we'd agree this is a different Steelers team. But now this is also a different Browns team. Deshaun Watson had come in, looked very shaky in his first few starts for the Browns, and still didn't look great in this last one. But he finished the game 9 of 18, 169 yards, 3 touchdown passes, no interceptions. 2 of them went to Amari Cooper for huge plays. Nick Chubb still ran for 104 yards, granted on the 7-8-1 Washington Commanders, but still, this is now a game where, the Steelers' recipe, I think, for winning the past few games is stop the run, force the quarterback to be great, trust that your defense can hold up against them, and then hope that your offense can just score enough points to get to the finish line. Is Deshaun Watson's performance last week against the Commanders, is that a red alarm for you that maybe that a game plan is going to cost the Steelers in their last game of the season?
I think it's probably still the smart, the wise plan to employ against these Browns. I mean, this team still starts and ends with Nick Chubb in that run game.
I agree.
That's everything that they're built for. And even with Deshaun Watson, their shiny new quarterback, they are still a run-first team right now, especially as he continues to transition himself into becoming a Cleveland Brown and growing in this new role as their starting quarterback. And look, I look at last week and, it is the lowly Washington Commanders, and they've certainly had their share of struggles. But I look at the stat line, 3 touchdown passes for Deshaun Watson, but still for the third time in 5 games, he's failed to complete over 55% of his passes, 9 of 18. Maybe it's efficient because he threw touchdowns on 3 of 9 passes, but 9 of 18 is not something that really strikes fear in me. I think that maybe is just a good game against a Washington team, not necessarily a sign that Deshaun Watson's the guy that was tearing it up in Houston 3 years ago. So I think this game plan still starts and ends with stop Nick Chubb and make them go into passing situations and allow TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith and Cam Hayward to pin their ears back and get after him. I don't think the Steelers really should change all that much what they've been doing game plan wise. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Now, I still don't think that you can keep winning football games with 13 points and stuff.
I agree.
And especially going up against a Browns team that does have weapons. They may have not all gelled and clicked together. And while I'm not necessarily all that bullish that it's going to start this week against the Steelers, we saw what happened in that game against the Ravens. They were almost pitching a shutout, the Steelers defense, but one personal foul call in the red zone that shouldn't have been called, that went the wrong way, completely changed the complexion of the game and momentum. And that's something that they didn't really do anything wrong. It was something totally out of their control. So you can't leave things up to chance. I think offensively, they have to find a way to score more points. They have to find a way to be more productive, however that happens to be. But defensively, keep doing what you're doing. It's worked like a charm. They're on this run right now. I wouldn't switch anything up dramatically.
No, I agree. You got to keep to what your plan is, and I think we kind of saw that right with the Raiders game, because the Steelers could have put a whole bunch of focus on stopping the pass game with Derek Carr and Hunter Renfrow and Devontae Adams and Darren Waller, and they did. Minka Fitzpatrick said, "Yeah, we schemed to take Devontae Adams out, but we trusted everyone else to win their one-on-ones across the board. But the primary focus for the defense was to stop Josh Jacobs, who was the leading rusher in the NFL when they played the Raiders. I think it has to be the same game plan this week. I know that Deshaun Watson has the pedigree of the potential to be an elite quarterback, but you know what? Like you said, that 3-touchdown game that he had last week, that kind of broke the chain of a lot of very mediocre performances, and even kind of like it was, like you kind of said, still was a mediocre performance. 50% of his passes completed in that game, and I thought some of the throws that were made to make that happen were kind of just happenstance, like, that worked out in your favor. But if the Steelers stay disciplined, if they don't give up wide open wide receivers, and there's going to be dink and dunk plays like we saw with Tyler Huntley, there's going to be plays that you give up here and there. But by and large, keep the big play from happening. Force Deshaun Watson to have to keep making plays down the field, and just don't let Nick Chubb take over the game. Then you put your defense in a situation where you have more chances at turnovers. And if your offense is able to put some points on the board, maybe they get desperate, and maybe Deshaun Watson, who's still definitely trying to get his legs under him, makes the key mistakes that gives you the advantage.
And there's definitely still, I think, some context to add to Watson's performance last week, too. Like, we got to take into account that Carson Wentz couldn't hold on to the football. So continuously turning the ball over and putting that Browns offense in, positive opportunities where they could, score points in that game. That's part of the thing you have to take into account. You also have to look at the fact that he got sacked 5 times in that game, too. And that's a very good Commanders pass rush, just like the Steelers have a very good pass rush. So there are going to be opportunities for TJ Watt, Highsmith, and Hayward to get home and get after him. And if that's part of the game plan to get him under duress, get him trying to play more of that backyard football style of stuff that, like I said, maybe 3 years ago, Deshaun Watson, that's still his bread and butter and why everyone was so excited about him. But maybe that's one of the things that when you've had such a long layoff as he did, that has to take still more time to come back to and fully feel comfortable in those situations. Maybe he's a little more skittish right now. So I think, to reiterate, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Continue to do what you've been doing. But looking back on the performances, it's a little bit of fool's gold to me last week. Those throws that worked out in his favor that probably could have been 50-50 or questionable, but the fact that he was sacked 5 times and that offense for the Browns continued to get set up because how putrid Carson Wentz was. I think the Steelers are still set up in a good scenario with this one, with their season on the line.
The last time Deshaun Watson, the only time, in fact, that Deshaun Watson played the Steelers was back in 2020 when he was with the Houston Texans. Went 19 of 27 for 264 yards, 2 touchdown passes, threw an interception, but just like his last game with the Browns, was sacked 5 times. We'll see how the Steelers handle him this week. Tomorrow's crossover Thursday, which means we'll have our man from Locked On Browns, Jeff. He's going to be here. It's going to be a live show. It's going to be really awesome. It's going to be great talking to him. But Kale, thank you so much for joining us here. It's always a pleasure. We're going to have you back here. Glad to do shows with you on WPXI and do shows with you on Locked On Steelers. Definitely going to talk with you more. Let people know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Chris, I appreciate you having me. It was fun. Can't wait to do it again. You can check me out on Twitter at @Kale_Burger and hear me on 93.7 The Fan and as well on WPXI Final Word as well. Some Sunday nights throughout the month. And you can mainly hear me on the weekends on 93.7 The Fan as well. Had fun, Chris. Looking forward to doing it again.
Absolutely. Thanks to Kale. Thanks to you for checking us out here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We're on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. Like this video if you saw it on YouTube. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily episodes. Rate this show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And if you do that with a positive comment, you get a shout out at the end of the show. Thanks again for checking us out. Back Thursday with Crossover Thursday, getting you ready for Steelers, Browns, and all the things they need to happen to make the playoffs. We'll see you then.